Because as of mid this past week, I was just going to be like you guys, attending church. I wasn't planning to be up on stage until I got a text a few days ago from Pastor Jonathan, who told me that he has COVID and would I mind stepping in to preach for him. Now, to allay everybody's fears, Jono is doing okay. I've been in contact with him throughout the week. He's got some mild symptoms and he's isolating at home right now. In fact, I know that he's watching because he called me yesterday and then he texted me just as I was about to come up on stage. So everybody turn around and say hello to Pastor Jonathan, send him all your best, or not, just keep looking at me, that's totally fine as well. Jono, we hope you are doing well. So glad that you're not feeling too sick, and I know that you're on the mend as well. So obviously keep the whole family in your prayers. That would be absolutely awesome. You know, as I was thinking about Jono in that experience, what I started to think was, Jono now has got his own chapter in a story that we all are going to tell one day. At one point in the future, we're all going to tell a story about the COVID-19 pandemic. It's hard for us to see that now because we're in the middle of it, but there is a day coming when this is just going to be a story that we tell. In fact, in early 2020, when the COVID pandemic started to break out around the world, my family and I were living in the US. And as lockdowns started to happen and as panic buying started to take place in the supermarkets and in the stores, as schools and churches started to close down and we started learning about some close friends who had contracted COVID really early on, my wife and I kept telling our 3 daughters that they need to be taking note of what's happening around them right now and maybe even keep a journal, because we told them they were living through what would become a historic moment in the history of the world. This is a historic moment that they're living through, that we're all living through. So we told them that one day they would look back on this and they would, tell their kids, tell their grandkids stories about this season in their lives. When this is all said and done and they're looking back on their life, this will be a chapter that they tell their kids and their grandkids. And I know that right now, especially this Sunday, as you've just heard, maybe for the first time, that your pastor has COVID, I know that tensions are really high around this COVID situation right now. But again, one day, this season is going to be just a story that we tell. And we all will eventually have stories about how we coped with lockdowns. We'll have stories about how much we hated wearing masks. We'll have stories about how we used to have to check in to every place and restaurant we went to using QR codes. We're going to tell stories to our kids about that. We're going to tell stories about how we struggled to find toilet paper. Some of us, like Jonathan, are going to tell stories about what it was like to have COVID. Some will tell stories about why we got vaccinated. Some will tell stories about why we didn't get vaccinated. Some of us are going to have stories that we're going to tell our kids about how we panicked at the supermarket and cleaned the shelves out of every essential without any regard for our neighbors. Some of us are going to tell stories about how we stacked on the COVID-19 kilos without any regard for our own health. Let's be honest. Maybe some of us will have stories about the fear that we experienced during this season. Hopefully, some of us will have stories about how we experienced God during this season. And some of us are going to have stories about how we adapted and how we innovated and how we excelled during this season as we chose faith over fear. See, for future generations, COVID is just going to be a story that we tell or a story that they are told. But for us right now, on this day in January 2022, For us, it's not a story, it's actually current events. And that's why I think it's so interesting. That's why I think it's so interesting, this season that we're going through. See, because whenever we go through a memorable situation, a significant situation, or a series of unusual events, or a season in our life, it's something that is happening to us right in that particular moment. But when it's behind us, when the season or the situation we're in is in the rearview mirror, what it becomes for us is a story that we get to tell. Or maybe it's a story we hope we never have to tell. Maybe you're in a situation right now that even in this moment, you're already projecting to what it's going to be like at the other side of this story, and you're thinking that it's maybe a story that's going to be too embarrassing or too painful for you to tell. And the thing that determines which of these categories your situation falls into is the decisions that you make. The decisions that you make in every moment will determine the story that you tell. Because, I mean, I'm sure some of you have thought about it like this before, but we write the story of our lives one decision at a time. We write our own story with every decision that we make in every situation, in every season. Now, whatever your current situation is, whatever your current season of life, once it's passed, this will become just a story that you tell. But whether or not you want to tell that story will depend on the decisions that you make in the moment. So today, I really only have just one question that I want everybody to consider over the next couple of minutes. I've only got one question to ask you today. And the question is this: what story do you want to tell? What story do you want to tell about the current season you're in? What story do you want to tell about your life? What story do you want to share with your kids or your grandkids? When you meet someone new and they ask you, hey, how are you going? What story do you want to tell them about the moment that you're in? When this season of life is over, when this situation, whatever that situation is in for you, when that relationship is over, when the business transaction has finished, when the job or the class or the course that you're currently doing is over, and it becomes just a story that you tell, what story do you want to tell? Do you want to be the hero of your story, or do you want to be the villain of the story? Do you want to tell a story where you set a good example, or do you want to have a story that you're too scared to tell because you know it's going to set a bad example for your kids or your grandkids or whoever it is that you're talking to? Which option would make you proud to tell your story to your kids, your grandkids one day? And the good news is this: the story that you tell is up to you. You get to decide the story that you tell because you write the story of your life one decision at a time. Every decision that we make writes the story of our lives because every decision that we make has consequences. Every decision we make has outcomes that impact us and impact the people around us. You see, your life is more than just a series of random, disconnected events. Your story is being written every day with every decision that you make. I mean, imagine if you're at work, right? Whatever field you work in, imagine you're at work and your boss comes to you and he tells you, hey, I need you to lie to this customer or to this client. And so you make a decision in that moment to lie. And you lie to the customer or the client, and the client calls you out on it, tells your boss, who throws you under the bus, and as a consequence, you get fired. You get fired for telling a lie that your boss told you to tell. That's not a story that you would want to share with your family members. Or imagine this scenario. Your boss, same situation, asks you to lie to a client or a customer, and you make the decision not to lie. And as a result, your boss fires you anyway. Now, that's not a great story, but isn't that a better story to tell? That you maintained and kept your integrity? Or how about this? You meet a guy or you meet a girl and you know that they're not the right person for you, there's something a little bit off about them, but there's really nobody else on the horizon, and you feel like you've got no other options, so you decide to go out on a date with them, and that leads to a second date. And while there's a couple of issues that keep cropping up, you keep dating them, and after 2 years, the relationship eventually falls apart. And you get to a point where you hope that the next person you meet doesn't ever ask you about that story. Or imagine that your friends ask you to go out to a party or go out to a nightclub with them, but you know that you've got an exam the next morning, so you say no. And then you continue to say no week after week when they are constantly asking you to go to these parties with them because you know you want to study. And you make those decisions over the next couple of years, and eventually you end up with a degree and you're starting a new career. Isn't that a good story? Isn't that a story that you would be proud to tell? The point is that every decision you make becomes part of your story, which means you get to decide. So, what story do you want to tell? What story do you want to tell? Now, the difficulty with this, the challenge with this, in the midst of our circumstances, is we don't often think of what we're going through in the context of our whole life, because we're so emotionally invested in that specific moment. But the reality is that the decisions we make while we're in the valleys eventually become the stories we tell on the other side of the valley. So what story do you want to tell? Now, something I think that's true of all of us is that whenever we meet a new person and we get asked about, hey, what do you do? Tell me a little bit of your story. Tell me where you came from. Tell me about your family. I think what's true of all of us is we don't want to have stories. We don't want to have chapters that we feel we have to skip over when we're sharing our story. We don't want to have those stories that we have to embellish to make it sound like we're a bit better than we actually were in those moments. We don't want to have to hide the truth, right? When somebody asks us to share their story. Because all of us want to be the hero of our story. And we certainly don't want to have one of those chapters that we have to hide from everybody else. Those chapters that we have to skirt around when we're sharing the story of our life, or we're sharing a story about a situation or a circumstance that happened to us. And the great thing is that there's still time for everybody in this room, for everybody who's watching online, there's still time for you to have that sort of story. But it's going to require you to be able to stop. To be able to stop in the middle of a decision or a situation and ask yourself, what story do I want to tell about my life and about this situation and about this moment? And the reality is, that's really hard to do. Because we're often making these decisions in such quick succession. We're usually making these decisions with so much pressure upon us and so much emotion in the moment that we don't think of it in the context of our whole life. We don't think of it as a story we might tell one day. Because truthfully, it's hard to think about tomorrow when you're struggling to get through today. Tomorrow seems so hard when you're just trying to get enough courage to get through today. And our emotions, let's be honest, our emotions only ever complicate the issue even further because our emotions often cause us to focus on the immediate instead of the ultimate. I mean, think of it. Most likely, our worst decisions, if you look back on the story of your life right now and you think of those worst decisions that you made, they were probably fueled by emotional appeal. Something was so emotionally appealing to you that you made a decision that you later regret, and it becomes a story you don't want to tell. I mean, there was so much emotional appeal around that thing that you bought it. Something was so appealing that you leased it. Something was so appealing that you ate it, you drank it, you smoked it. It was so appealing that you dated it, that you moved in with it. Emotions complicate the issue. So here's a tip. This is a free tip for you to write down. If you're watching online, write this down. Whenever you're confronted with something or someone that is emotionally appealing, where there's strong emotions involved, hit pause, not play. Hit pause, not play. When you're in a situation where you're faced with a decision that has strong emotional appeal around it, we should step back instead of lean in. And this is really important. We should step back, not because that person isn't the right person and isn't eventually the one that we're going to be with. They might be. We shouldn't step back because that business opportunity, that investment opportunity isn't a fantastic opportunity. It might be. We shouldn't step back because that job you've been offered is the perfect job. It may well be. We should step back because strong emotions will always cloud our judgment. We should step back and say, I just need to think about that for a minute. I just need to talk to a friend about that for just a moment. And I think the story in the Bible of Joseph is a great reminder of how powerful it is to think of the decisions you make within the context of your entire life. The story of Joseph is a really good example of that. It's one of my favorite stories for a whole bunch of different reasons. Now, just to be super clear to all of you, I'm not talking about this Joseph. I'm not talking about the Christmas Joseph, okay? I'm actually talking about this Joseph. You know, the one who had that really amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. I don't know if you've seen the movie or if you've seen the play. I'm talking about that Joseph who went to Egypt. I'm not talking about the Christmas Joseph. Now, I know that, especially for people who've been attending church for a while, this is a pretty well-known story. Probably most of you could recite it, but for the people who are watching or the people who are here who aren't that familiar with the story, let me just skim over it. Let me just paraphrase it a little bit for you so you can catch up. See, in about 1800 BC, there's a guy named Joseph who's the 11th of 12 brothers, and he finds himself in a no-win situation that was not of his making. It was not his fault at all. You see, Joseph's father, a guy named Jacob, favored Joseph over all of his other brothers, and the bad thing was all of his brothers knew that. They all knew that Joseph was the favorite, so it fueled jealousy and anger in them. So much jealousy that they all made a decision that they were going to kill Joseph. And so they grab him and they beat him. And then at the last minute, they all lose their nerve. And instead of killing him, they decide they're going to sell him into slavery, which is just as bad in some ways, but it's a lot more profitable as well. A lot less violent, a lot more profitable for them. But now, here's the thing, these 10 brothers, these 10 young men, they have a story that they're going to always skip over. They've got a story that they are going to be embarrassed to tell. In fact, can you imagine it? One of those 10 brothers meets a young lady and he takes her out on a date and they're sitting across from each other and they put their phones down so that they can have a talk to each other. And the girl says, hey, tell me a little bit about your family. And one of that brother's going to have to say, well, you know, look, there used to be 12 of us, but me and 9 of my other brothers, we got our young brother and we took him out and we beat him up. There were 9 of us and 1 of him. I mean, who would want to tell that story? I mean, the story is so bad that they actually had to lie to their dad and say that Joseph was eaten by a wild animal. They've got a story that they don't want to tell because they understand it's not a good story. So Joseph gets sold off into slavery and he ends up on an auction block in Egypt where he's bought by a military leader by the name of Potiphar. Now, Joseph has to make a decision in that moment. He could try to escape, or he could, basically do the bare minimum of what was required of him as a slave just to survive, or he could do his best in the situation that he's in. He could take the lemons he's been given and make lemonade. He has a choice to make. And here's where I think Joseph's story becomes relatable to all of us. Here's where I think Joseph's narrative, the stuff that had happened in Joseph's life, becomes relatable to all of us. I think we can all relate to the fact that none of this was Joseph's fault. None of this was Joseph's fault. I think we can all relate to that. We've all found ourselves in situations where our story started to turn bad, and we look back and we go, that wasn't really my fault. Joseph's story was hijacked by someone else's selfish decisions. But instead of being negative about it, Joseph decides to make the best of the circumstances he's in and to serve Potiphar's house as if it was his own house. And Potiphar notices over the course of a couple of years, Potiphar notices and decides to put Joseph in charge of his whole entire household. Joseph is taking control back and deciding that he wanted to tell a good story in the context of his life. I mean, think about it. Joseph has been beaten up by his own brothers, sold into slavery by his own brothers, and made a slave, but he decided in the moment to give his best to Potiphar's house. Now, that's a story that's worth telling. For the parts where Joseph had control of the pen, he wrote a story that would inspire generations. But then, another circumstance crops up that was out of his control. His life intersects with Potiphar's wife, and he finds himself again in a situation through no fault of his own that is an absolute no-win situation. See, Potiphar's wife demands that Joseph sleep with her. And in the ancient world, this was not an uncommon thing, but it also wasn't a moral thing. This was just a thing where Joseph was put in a life and death situation. He had to choose. In fact, it wasn't even life and death, it was death and death. Because either way that he chose, there was literally no win for him. No win at all. He had two options and there was no good outcome. For Joseph, option number one was, I remain faithful to the opportunity that God has opened up to me through finding favor with Potiphar. That's option number one. But that would get him in trouble with Potiphar's wife, ultimately, and could eventually lead to his death. Option number two Joseph had was, well, I can take advantage of the opportunity God has opened up for him and have an affair with Potiphar's wife. They were his two options. Which option sounds like the story that you would want to tell? Now, it's important to remember that Joseph at this point is about 19 or 20 years old, but even at such a young age, he once again opts for the better story by doing something that is really significant, by doing something that I think we can all learn from today. He's a young man faced in a no-win situation where if the people on Twitter find out either way that he went, he's going to get ridiculed, he's going to get slammed, he's going to get trolled. He's in this no-win situation, but he does something significant that we can all learn from, that we all should take note of today. What he does, Scripture tells us, what he does is he rehearses his story out loud to remind himself of how this decision may impact the rest of his life. When we pick up the story in Genesis chapter 39, we find Joseph telling Potiphar's wife this, and I quote, "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care." Now, the translation of this is essentially, my story started out really, really bad, but I've made decisions through the course of my life to ensure that my story is starting to get good. I've got all of this responsibility. I've got all of this respect. I've prioritized a high work ethic. I've prioritized integrity. What story do I now want to tell, Mrs. Potiphar? Do I want to tell a story where I had an affair with my master's wife? What story do you want to tell, Mrs. Potiphar? Do you want a chapter in your story where you had an affair with a Hebrew slave? He's rehearsing his story out loud to remind himself of how this circumstance, this situation will fit into the context of his life. And I think that's something we can all learn from today, because in the situation we all find ourselves in, through no fault of our own, we have the opportunity to make decisions that will determine the story that we tell after this season is over. And Joseph goes on, "No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife." Joseph now is reminding her of her story. He's doing it for himself, but he's also trying to remind her of her story. You are his wife. And he continues, how then? He continues by asking this awesome question. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? The translation? Why would I want to add adultery to a story that started bad but is now turning out to be pretty good? And in fact, I'm getting opportunities I would never have ever dreamed of. Which of these two stories, Mrs. Potiphar, do you think I want to tell? Which story do you want to tell? When the decision or the situation that you're in the middle of right now is nothing more than a story that you tell, what story do you want to tell? Now, you probably already know that Joseph chose the better of the two stories, but even then, things didn't work out right away. Potiphar's wife accused him of rape, and he gets thrown into prison. But Joseph's story wasn't over. And if you take one thing away from today, know this: your story is not over either. Your story is not over. Whatever situation you're facing right now, your story is not over. Often, when you're going through a long and difficult season, it feels like this chapter that we're in is the entire story, right? But it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. It's often our decisions during those hard seasons, during those tough times, that determine how the current situation will turn out and the story that we end up telling. The decisions we make now when times are tough will determine whether or not the story we tell ends badly or ends well. And even though he ends up in prison, in the prison of Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt at the time, Joseph again continues to make good decisions because he wants to write a good story. He eventually wins the favor of the prison wardens, which, let's be honest, that's nobody's goal in life, to make favor with the prison warden, right? None of us are hoping that that's our story one day. But he does. He does the best in his situation. He does the best in the circumstance that he finds himself in. Joseph is called to give Pharaoh some advice about how he should run the country for the next 14 years. And in this moment, this is an unthinkable thing. A prisoner has gone to stand in front of Pharaoh, the leader of the country, to give advice about how to run the country. And nobody in that time would have given advice to Pharaoh. Pharaoh was the man. Pharaoh was the guy who made all the decisions. But Pharaoh listens to Joseph, and he responds by giving Joseph an unprecedented opportunity to be the prime minister of Egypt. This prisoner has become the prime minister because he stepped back and made decisions in the moment that determined the context of his entire story. Now, obviously, I've skipped over a whole bunch of details here, right? I've stepped over a whole bunch of different things because I had to skip it because we just don't have enough time today. But I want to encourage you to go home and read this story. If you're online right now, I want to encourage you to look up Genesis 39 online and read that whole story. If you've got your phone out, go to the YouVersion Bible app or whatever Bible app you have and make a note. Open up your note program and just write a note to read Genesis 39, because it's a fascinating story with a lot of interesting details that we can learn a lot from. So again, Joseph has gone from being a prisoner to being the prime minister under Pharaoh. And after rolling out this plan that he had, that the advice that he gave Pharaoh, after he rolls that out, he sees the country of Israel he sees them through this really tough period. And eventually, as Egypt starts to prosper, Joseph's brothers come back into his life. Joseph's brothers come to Egypt looking for help. And they don't recognize their now 30-something-year-old brother, who they beat and sold into slavery as a 17-year-old. They don't notice him, they don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. And when he reveals himself to his brothers, you can think they're naturally terrified, because they've been telling this whole other story of lies their whole life, and now they've been found out. Now they've been called out on it. And they assume that Joseph is going to treat them in the same way that they treated him. But Joseph didn't react. Joseph never reacted. Joseph decided. There's a big difference between reacting to a situation and deciding about a situation. He knew better than that. What Joseph knew was that your past can either make you bitter or it can make you better. Your past can either make you bitter or it can make you better. That's a really important thing. In fact, it's so important, I want to throw it up on the screen. Because some people need to take a photo of this to be reminded of this. Your past or your current circumstances can either make you bitter or they can make you better. And when you decide to not let your past determine your future, that's when you truly become free. When you decide to not let your past determine your future, that's when you become free. And in this moment, Joseph was free. He was free to write his own story. He was free to write a better story. He decided to have a story worth telling. Joseph wanted to have a story worth telling, and that's why we're telling his story. Joseph decided that the bitterness and the revenge that he could have felt would not be part of his story. And as a result, not only did Joseph help all of Egypt, but he helped his whole family as well. And that is a story worth telling. He wrote his story one decision at a time. Which brings me back to us. Which brings me back to you and your current situation. What story do you want to tell? What story do you want to tell? When you think back on this situation that you're in now, this decision that you're on the brink of making, this circumstance, this relationship that you're in, what story do you want to tell? Like Joseph and his brothers, you are writing the story of your life. You're writing that story one decision at a time. So write a good one. Write a good story. And if you're thinking right now that you haven't written a good story up until this point, or if your current chapter is not one that you're particularly proud of, I just want you to remember, it's just one chapter. It's not the whole story. Again, your story is not finished. Your story isn't over. Your story is still continuing. Your story isn't finished. So as we wrap up, I want to challenge you to make a decision. I actually want to encourage you to make a decision right now, today, in this moment, whether you're in the room with us, if you're watching online, I want to encourage you right now to make this decision. The decision is this. I want you to decide this, that I'll decide a story I'll be proud to tell. I'll decide a story I'll be proud to tell. I want you to process that right now. And I want you to decide that you will write a story that you're going to be proud to tell. And the next time, whenever you're faced with a significant decision, I want you to ask yourself, when what I'm currently going through is just a story, what story do I want to be able to tell? And then I want you to decide accordingly. I want you to decide, what story do you want to tell? What story do you want to tell? I know for me personally, I grew up in a broken family in the western suburbs of Melbourne, where most of my family members were drug users, were alcoholics, or were in and out of prison. And statistically speaking, somebody who's born into that cycle of poverty and addiction and crime continues that cycle. They just do what they've seen, they perpetuate that, and it goes on generationally. But at a certain point in my life, I decided to write a better story. And this is not just rhetoric that a pastor says on stage, because I can tell you the exact moment, the exact day, and the exact decision I made when I decided I am going to write a better story with my life. because I want to tell a better story, and I want my kids who weren't even born then, I want my family to tell a better story than the story that I was told by my family. And the decision I made was really simple. I made a decision to become a follower of Jesus. And I want to be super clear here. I didn't do this because I had this religious experience. I didn't do this because a beam of light shot out of heaven and a voice called down to me. I didn't do this because I had a near-death experience. I didn't do this because I got knocked over at an event, or that somebody shared so much truth with me that it bowled me down and I had no other choice. If I'm really honest, I made this decision intellectually because a friend had shared with me their story about Jesus, the story that they were writing about their faith. And what I saw in that person was that following Jesus had made their life better and made them better at life. And when I saw that, when I experienced that, when I heard that, I wanted that for my life. Because I believed in that moment, not that I was going into heaven, I believed that following Jesus would make my life better and make me better at life. And it was as simple as that. That was the decision that I made when I was in year 11 in high school. And that changed the course of my life. It changed the course of my story. That chapter has defined so much of my life. And I'm so glad to say it's also rewritten my family story as well. As my daughters have grown up as the first kids in our family and in my wife's family as well to grow up with Christian parents. We don't always know what we're doing because we didn't have Christian parents to model ourselves off, but I keep saying to my kids this, and it's the same thing I would tell all of you, and it's the same thing I would tell all of you. Following Jesus has made my life better and made me better at life. And I believe it can do the same for you as well. That's a decision that I made to write a better story. And so today, as I close, I just want to give you one more piece of encouragement. What story are you writing? What story are you writing right now with the decisions that you're making? What story are you writing? Because you're writing the story of your life. And I want to encourage you to write a better one. Father God, I just want to thank you for the words of Scripture, the stories of the Bible that have been maintained, the records have been kept for us to read centuries later. God, I want to thank you for that because there's so much wisdom, there's so much truth, there's so much integrity to be found in the covers of the Bible. And Father, I just want to thank you for that, first of all. And I thank you for the opportunity we have, God, that you give us to write a new story, to continually write a better story for each one of us. And God, I want to pray for everybody here right now, everybody who's watching online, anybody who's under the sound of my voice, whether they're watching on YouTube or if they're listening to a podcast weeks from now. God, I want to pray that you'll be with them and that you would help them write a better story. God, in those moments when emotion and pressure are weighing in, give them the moment to pause and to step back instead of lean in, to step back and consider the decision they're about to make in the context of their whole life. God, we pray all of this in the amazing name of Jesus. And everybody agreed and said, amen. Before you go, if you want to make that decision like I made, then I want to encourage, if you're processing that decision, that following Jesus will make your life better and make you better at life, we've got a connect area up the back. And I just want to encourage you just to go up the back and have a chat with somebody. Talk to them about that decision and what it might look like for you in your life. If you're watching online, if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube weeks from now, leave a comment for us. And somebody from this church will get back to you and connect with you and help walk you through that process of what that might look like. But if you're here today, I want to encourage you, go and chat with somebody up the back. Ask them some questions about what it might look like for you to follow Jesus as well. Guys, thank you so much for being here today. We can't wait to stay connected with you throughout the week on social media. See you soon.
different kinds of ways. Can you relate? We both know what it's like to be hurt. We both know what it's like to feel pain. But I think it's safe to say we're on to better days. Can you relate? Can you relate? Have you ever been left when you should have been loved? Has there ever been a time when you stayed but you should have run? 'Cause I've been real, I've been fake. Been a sinner, been a saint. I've been right, I've been so wrong. Yeah, I've made my mistakes. Now I don't know what it's like to be you. You don't know what it's like to be me. What if we're all the same in different kinds of ways? Can you relate? We both know what it's like to be hurt. We both know what it's like to feel pain. But I think it's safe to say we're on to better days. Can you relate? Can you relate? Can you relate? Can you relate? I don't know what it's like to be. You don't know what it's like to be me. But by the grace of God, we'll see each other's heart. I was there on the day that your world changed. You were scared, unprepared for the heartbreak. Everything you knew faded out of you. Stole a piece